introduce our first presenter, Madison Tisdale, whose project is called Scared of Learning. She worked on this with her advisor, Dr. McCormick. There's a longer subtitle than I'll let you read. And without further ado, I welcome you on up to the podium to get started.
Okay. Well, thank you all for showing up to listen to me speak today. I'm Maddie. I'm McCormick. I've been a great help to me with this presentation. I've had a bit scared of learning as we talk about LGBTQ plus student safety in U.S. high schools. Alright, so what can first be concluded from the research is that as a whole, LGBTQ plus students feel unsafe in U.S. high schools. This graph here is from the 2019 survey from Madison, which is what I'll reference throughout this presentation. But this one here shows that about 60% of students in U.S. high schools feel unsafe because of their sexual orientation, and another 40% because of their gender identity. So it's a very large chunk of students feeling that these identities take precedent in their feelings of safety over other identities such as race, religion, ethnicity, and other reasons. And the reason that they feel unsafe is because they experience a negative school climate or a negative atmosphere in which they are facing hostile circumstances where they're forced to learn. The first reason is because of verbal harassment. This includes verbal bullying, negative language all around, hearing anti-LGBT remarks. In this first graph, you can see that about 45% of LGBTQ youth experience verbal harassment at least sometimes for their sexual orientation, and another 40% for their gender identity. So a huge chunk of students feel this way, at least semi-regularly. Tied in with this is anti-LGBT remarks, as I mentioned. In this graph, you can see the different types of remarks, things like that's okay, you're homo, which are more casual, and then you get into the slurs as well, which it's very shocking to see that a very small percentage of these students either rarely or never experience this, with another over 50% of them experiencing this either often or frequently. And then the last component that I'm going to mention is physical harassment. Physical harassment is what we might think of as more stereotypical bullying, hand-to-hand contact, physical contact, more casual things, hair pulling, pushing, shoving. This graph shows that while these students do experience this a lot less frequently than verbal harassment, there's still a large chunk of students that are experiencing this semi-regularly. About 15% experience it for their sexual orientation and about 10% for their gender identity. And what I really wanted to focus on is these outcomes of experiencing a negative school climate. The first being mental health. LGBTQ students trend higher for depression, they trend higher for anxiety, especially as it relates to school. They're less likely to participate in school activities, sports, after school organizations, and clubs. They have lower self-esteem and self-worth, and higher rates of suicidal ideology. And this is related to a minority stress model, which can be applied to other minorities as well, but it states that sexual minorities experience unique and hostile stressors. For example, the victimization I talked about when it refers to verbal harassment and physical harassment that impact their mental health negatively. The other outcome I want to speak about is physical safety. This includes physical violence. They experience physical violence at higher rates than other students do for their identity. They engage in riskier sexual behavior, including unprotected sex. They engage in more often, and they engage in sex with older individuals at a higher rate as well. They attempt suicide at a higher rate, as well as commit suicide at a higher rate, which both impact their physical health negatively. And they engage in drug use at higher rates, which they impact their physical safety as well. Another outcome is on their social circle. They experience social exclusion, fear, and isolation. This is, again, they engage in less peer activities, They don't have a support network like a lot of students do because they do not engage in sports and clubs at the same rates that their heterosexual and heteronormative counterparts do. And then what I initially focused this presentation on is academic success and how it impacts that. Their GPA trends lower because of the victimization that they face. Their attendance trends lower because of the victimization that they face. And they have less sure educational aspirations because of the victimization that they face. They're less likely to know what they intend to do after high school. They're less likely to have a sure answer as to whether or not they want to attend post-secondary institutions. And they're less likely to just have a plan for their future because of the victimization that they face in schools. This is just an example of academic success and how it negatively impacts their academic success. This one is specifically about attendance. It shows that higher experiences of victimization and other discrimination as well. So this one notes outside of LGBTQ identities. But higher victimization in general impacts their ability to attend school on a regular basis. And what I wanted to touch on as well is solutions, what the research says are solutions to these problems and how come. I've separated into 3 categories: programs, policies, and curriculum. The first one I'm going to touch on is policies. This graph here shows that very few schools have a policy related to LGBTQ students in general. Around 10% for both trans and non-binary identities as well as LGBT identities. So it's very unlikely that schools are going to have these policies in place, which is one of the few things that in high schools can protect these students because they lay out clear consequences and guidelines for actions against LGBTQ+ students. The next category I want to talk about is programs. This includes GSAs, which are a very strong program in schools that can help reduce victimization. GSAs are gay straight alliances or gay student alliances, so it creates a support network for these students. As you can see from the chart on the left, it shows that victimization for both sexual orientation and gender expression decreased with the presence of GSAs in schools. And the right shows that schools with a GSA have more supportive staff in schools as well. So a GSA really creates a big network of support that these students can have. And then what I wanted to focus on most and what my final product for this thesis will entail is inclusive curriculum. Inclusive curriculum in the scholarship is generally focused on higher education at the college level, LGBTQ focused courses, but that's because most adults in this world think that high school and middle school is too early to be discussing these topics with students, especially at a public school level. They don't think that their students should be introduced to that, which is just not true in the case. It's also typically focused on sexual education. You can see from the graph on the right that there's almost no inclusion in sexual education either, which is really helpful. And there's even negative inclusion in most of this, which would be saying that gay sex is riskier than straight sex and kind of creating this separation. So that's even about as likely as having any inclusion at all that's remotely positive. And then it's proven that inclusion in education and curriculum as a whole is good for all minorities, but especially LGBTQ students. They have not seen that representation in schools, especially their public schools, and it helps reduce victimization by teaching these students about gay issues. And it's just not common for it to be seen, especially at the high school level, especially at the public high school level in Texas education. The Texas education system just does not support these students in the way that it should. And then this graph here just shows how curriculum can be so influential in decreasing the victimization for LGBTQ students. When the school has inclusive curriculum, there is less frequency of hearing LGBT remarks, anti-LGBT remarks. So gay use in a negative way decreases. saying that no homo decrease as well, other homophobic remarks, and even remarks regarding gender expression. So education is really a way to combat the victimization that these students are facing. And there are going to be barriers to implementing this, again, especially in Texas. The reason for that is the conservatism that a lot of adults in American society feel. And this is obviously heightened by different divides. The urban versus rural divide is going to be a lot more difficult to implement this in a rural area than an urban area. You can think of maybe the difference between Central Austin and its surrounding areas and their party affiliations. Private school versus public school as well. It's going to be a lot easier to implement this in private schools because they do not have to follow the state guidelines that public schools do. And then state party affiliations play a big factor as well because public schools have to follow state guidelines. This map here shows different state guidelines for discussing homosexuality in public education. You can see Texas specifically has restrictions on how to discuss homosexuality as part of curriculum, especially in sexual education. There's other states that are more supportive. We just recently moved from being one of the states that says that you can't discuss it at all, or that it has to be discussed in a certain way. So we actually moved up, but there's still a lot of progress to be made when it comes to education on LGBT issues in Texas. And so my main focus to combat the issues that are going on is the lesson plan. Mine is a history lesson plan on the AIDS epidemic from 1980 to the early 2000s. This is a high school history lesson plan, which the overview and purpose states that it aims to introduce students to the reality of the AIDS epidemic in its early stages and broaden their understanding of LGBTQ+ history. By analyzing individuals' position in society, the politics surrounding the AIDS epidemic, and the myths associated with the disease. So this aims to sort of myth bust what these students may have heard before, really just decrease the stigma around the AIDS epidemic that they may have heard or seen in popular literature or media. The education standards for lesson plan are going to differ by state. Text is what we follow in Texas for public education. In the Texas Administrative Code, Rule 113.41 says that historical context focuses on political, economic, and social events and issues related to industrialization and urbanization, major wars, domestic and foreign policies, and reform movements, including civil rights. And civil rights is what I really wanted to focus on when discussing this lesson plan, because although Texas State Code says that civil rights is what we should be discussing, it's not following that simultaneously. These are the objectives for the lesson plan. Students should be able to understand the AIDS epidemic in the context of the late 20th century. They should be able to obtain knowledge of important AIDS activists, individuals, and organizations active during the time of the AIDS epidemic. And students should be able to should be able to make connections between the AIDS activism movement and other social movements in recent history. So sort of connected to other movements such as the civil rights movement, women's rights movements, feminist movements. The materials that I plan to create for the lesson plan include lecture slides, something simple, not too wordy because it is geared toward high school students. A documentary is what I will also provide as a supplemental material. I'm looking at the ACT UP documentary specifically. Book excerpts, especially from this book called We Are Everywhere, which discusses important LGBTQ figures in history, and ACT UP, which is an important AIDS activism movement. The Check for Understanding is a brief presentation that the students would create, and then the activity is a small group discussion with any questions. To begin setting up the presentations and make sure they're on the right track and have them express their knowledge through a presentation.
Are there questions for Madison?
Hi. That was an amazing presentation. I actually learned a lot from that, especially the statistics that you showed about how people feel more marginalized now about gender identity versus ethnic or racial identity. I assumed that those would be a little bit closer, so seeing that such a small percentage was really interesting. My question is there anything during this presentation or during this research project that you would have liked to explore more in depth? Or is there anything in the future that you have plans for this?
Absolutely. What I really wanted to focus on that I didn't really get the time to focus on is the intersectionality between identities. Students, you mentioned racial identities. This is specifically a survey of LGBTQ plus students, and so they are possibly more concerned with that over their other identities as why they're feeling unsafe. But that does not mean that the other identities don't come into play. I think that it's important when we're discussing any identity to discuss all of them at once. Someone who is in the LGBT community and also a racial minority and is also a religious minority may face a lot more discrimination and victimization than someone who is otherwise, maybe white, wealthy, and in the LGBT.
Thank you.
Other questions? I can't believe how much you packed in, not to this presentation, but to your thesis project, and to bring in so much background data to inform then this really completely thought through lesson plan, especially as a mom of a kid in Texas public schools. Gives me a lot of hope, and I was so impressed. I'd like to, that's not a question, I was just really impressed. I'd like to invite your advisor, Dr. McCormick, up, and Dr. McCormick will be able to say a few words and present Madison with the stole and cord that she'll wear at graduation to celebrate this work, but also 4 years of really incredible work on this program.
So I was listening to this presentation, following Maddie as she's put it together. I've been working with LGBTQ youth in the state of Texas who are trafficked and who are in the foster care system for the last 17 years. And as many of you know, and as Maddie so eloquently just kind of explained, there is an assault on LGBTQ kids in this state, unlike anything that we've seen with any other population. And there's assault from the legislature, assault from sometimes their peers, sometimes their families. The only thing that can counterbalance the effects of that assault and the harms and the trauma of that are people who are equally as steadfast and even more committed to inclusion and affirmation and authenticity. And it's so heartening, as Dr. Wolf said, it's so heartening to know that there are folks like Maddie who are devoting their educations and their careers and their professional lives and things to being that for folks. So it's a joy to work with you. Maddie, I get to put this on you. And this, and congratulations.